The rain was falling in torrents when Dale, a truck driver with over 15 years on the road, found himself driving on the forgotten back roads of Maine. His usual route was blocked due to a sudden landslide, and he was left with no choice but to traverse the less traveled paths. The rain blurred his vision, and soon his truck's headlights caught glimpses of humanoid shapes lining the sides of the road. At first he thought his tired eyes were playing tricks on him, but as he continued he realized the figures were real. They stood silently, cloaked in dark robes, their faces obscured by hoods. Each held a flickering candle, casting eerie shadows on the wet asphalt. Curiosity got the best of him, and he pulled over to ask one of the figures for directions. As he approached, a hauntingly beautiful hymn filled the air, echoing through the trees. The figure slowly looked up, revealing hollow eyes and a mouth that moved but produced no sound. The singing seemed to come from the woods itself. Panicking, Dale jumped back into his truck, but the engine sputtered and died. The hymn grew louder, more forceful, pulling at him, beckoning him to join the cloaked figures. Resisting the enchanting melody, Dale remembered the old CB radio installed in the back. In desperation, he sent out a distress call. Static greeted him, but soon a voice broke through. "This is Roadrunner, who's in distress." Dale quickly explained his situation, his voice barely audible over the increasingly powerful hymn. Roadrunner, an old-timer with knowledge of local law, recognized the tale. "Boy, you're caught in the highway hymns. It's an old cult ritual. They trap wanderers and make them one of their own. You must resist the hymn." Dale felt a pull, a desire to step out and join the figures. He fought the urge, holding onto the radio as his lifeline. "How do I escape?" "Music," Roadrunner replied, his voice urgent. "Drown their hymn with something louder, something from your soul." Desperate, Dale fumbled through his glove box and found an old harmonica his father had given him. He began to play a bluesy tune full of sorrow and hope. As he played, the harmonica's song battled with the cult's hymn, two opposing forces clashing in the storm. Dale poured his heart into every note, memories of his family and dreams flooding him. The harmonica's music began to overpower the cult's hymn. One by one, the cloaked figures dropped their candles, retreating into the woods, defeated. As the last figure vanished, the truck's engine roared back to life. Without a second thought, Dale sped away, the harmonica's song still ringing in his ears. Hours later, as dawn broke, he found himself back on familiar highways, the ordeal seeming more like a nightmare than reality. Grateful, he sent out a thank you over the radio to Roadrunner, but was met with static. Days later, during a pit stop at a local diner, Dale narrated his harrowing experience. An old trucker, overhearing him, walked over. "You said Roadrunner helped you?" Dale nodded. "Yes, he told me about the hymn and how to escape." The old trucker sighed, looking distant. "Roadrunner was my father. He got caught in the highway hymns 30 years ago. He never returned." Dale, stunned, glanced at his truck parked outside. Tucked into the visor was the old harmonica, a reminder that sometimes the past reaches out to save the present.
In the quiet town of Eerie, Maine, many whispered tales float among the locals, but none as persistent as the one about late-night Uber rides. People said that if you drove after midnight, sometimes you'd get a fare you'd never forget. Tom, a struggling writer and part-time Uber driver, hadn't been in Eerie for long. He was trying to find inspiration for his next novel and thought a change of scenery might help. He'd heard the stories, but dismissed them as just that, stories. Plus, the surge pricing after midnight meant he could make a decent wage. It was a damp, foggy night when he got the ping on his app. The profile simply read, Lucy. The pickup location was a spot he hadn't been to before, a dilapidated house on Neibolt Street. Upon arrival, Tom noticed that the house looked long abandoned. Moss-covered bricks, broken windows, and an eerie silence. But, as he was about to drive off, thinking it was a prank, the back door opened. A young woman with pale skin and raven black hair stepped inside. "Thanks for picking me up, Tom," she said, her voice soft yet unnerving. He glanced at his app, realizing he hadn't shared his name. "Did my name pop up on your app?" he asked, trying to shake off the unease. She just smiled. "Please drive. The destination is entered." Indeed, there was an address, but it was on the outskirts of town, a place he hadn't been to before. As they drove, she started humming a tune that was oddly familiar, like a lullaby but with a haunting undertone. The road seemed to stretch endlessly. The fog grew thicker, and the usual landmarks of Derry began to disappear. Tom's unease grew, but whenever he looked into the rearview mirror, Lucy's piercing blue eyes met his, quelling his rising panic. Her presence was hypnotic. Suddenly, the car radio crackled to life, even though Tom was sure he had turned it off. An old-timey song played, one that spoke of lost souls and endless rides. Lucy's humming matched the tune. Realizing something was deeply amiss, Tom decided to drop Lucy off at the next possible location and end this ride. But as he thought this, his car began to slow, its systems faltering. Having car trouble, Tom? Lucy asked, her voice dripping with false concern. Yeah, Tom grunted, trying to restart the engine. It sprang to life, but the controls weren't responding to his touch. The car seemed to have a will of its own, taking him deeper into the fog. Where are you taking me? Tom whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was asking Lucy or the car itself. To where you're needed, she replied cryptically. Tom remembered a trick from his younger, more reckless days. He'd swiftly shift to neutral and turn the ignition off and on. He tried it, and for a moment, the car stalled, giving him back control. Without wasting a second, he took a sharp turn onto a narrow road, hoping to throw off whatever force was at play. Lucy, however, didn't seem fazed. You can't escape your destiny, Tom. He remembered a nearby lake, Witcham Lake. Maybe water would disrupt whatever this was. With the lake in sight, he pushed the gas pedal to the floor. But Lucy just laughed, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. Suddenly, the car's headlights illuminated a figure in the road, an old man with a sign that read, "Derry welcomes you." In a desperate bid to avoid him, Tom swerved, and the car plunged into the cold waters of the lake. The icy grip of the water shocked Tom into action. He struggled, fighting his way to the surface, gasping for breath as he emerged. The fog had lifted, and the first rays of dawn painted the sky. Lucy and the car were nowhere in sight. The old man, however, stood at the shore, extending a hand to help him out. You're lucky, son. Not many escape Lucy's ride. Tom, panting and soaked, nodded. Who is she? The old man sighed. A lost soul. Bound to Derry and the roads here. She takes those she deems fit to join her. Why didn't she take me? Tom inquired, still shivering from the cold and fear. Perhaps you still have stories left to write, the old man replied, pointing to the town sign. The Derry welcomes you sign now read, Beware the midnight ride. Tom decided that morning that some tales were better left untold. He quit his Uber job, but the writer in him couldn't resist penning down his chilling encounter. As he wrote, he couldn't shake off the feeling that Lucy was still out there, waiting for her next ride, in the haunting streets of Derry.
Derry, Maine has always been a town of secrets, and for Susan, a dedicated home nurse, one particular winter night would unravel a tale she'd never forget. Susan had been a home nurse for 15 years, traveling to various parts of the town, tending to the sick and elderly. A noble job, though it came with its own challenges. The worst was Maine's cold, unforgiving winters. But tonight, it wasn't just the snowstorm outside that was chilling. It was the call she received at 11:57 p.m. The call was from a Mrs. McGowan, living on the outskirts of Derry. Her voice, a raspy whisper, conveyed urgency. Please come immediately. My husband's condition is worsening. Before Susan could inquire further, the line went dead. Against her better judgment and driven by her professional duty, Susan set out. The McGowan residence was an isolated house on the edge of the woods, a place locals often avoided, whispering about its tragic history of fires and disappearances. Arriving at the old Victorian house, Susan noted the dilapidation. Broken windows patched up, an unkempt lawn, and no lights save for a dim glow from one of the upstairs rooms. The front door creaked open before she could knock, revealing Mrs. McGowan, a frail old lady with piercing blue eyes. "Thank God you're here," she murmured, ushering Susan inside. As Susan stepped into the foyer, an uneasy feeling settled in. The house was cold, every sound amplified. Mrs. McGowan led her upstairs to where her husband, Mr. McGowan, lay. The room was dimly lit by a single candle. In the bed lay a man seemingly asleep. But Susan noticed something immediately off. His skin was unusually pale, with dark veins protruding, and his breathing was ragged. Mrs. McGowan, her eyes filled with tears, whispered, "It happens every full moon. He changes, becomes uncontrollable." The realization hit Susan hard. The tales she'd heard about werewolves weren't just tales. They were a terrifying reality, and she was in the epicenter. She began to gather her things, intent on leaving, when a bone-chilling howl echoed throughout the house. Mr. McGowan's transformation had begun. The man she had seen moments ago now convulsed violently, his fingers elongating into claws, his jaw distorting. A thick fur began to grow, covering his body. The transformation was horrifyingly swift. Susan, panic rising, backed towards the door, but Mrs. McGowan, surprisingly calm, grabbed her arm. "You can't leave now," she said, her voice a chilling monotone. "He hasn't fed." Suddenly, everything made a twisted sense. Susan was the bait. Summoning every ounce of courage, she pushed Mrs. McGowan, making a dash for the stairs. The werewolf, fully transformed, gave chase, its howls echoing in the night. But Susan had a plan. The stories always mentioned silver. Remembering the silver cross pendant she wore, she ripped it from her neck. As the creature lunged at her, she drove the sharp edge of the pendant into its heart. The werewolf let out a final mournful howl before collapsing, slowly reverting back to its human form. Mr. McGowan lay there, lifeless. Mrs. McGowan's screams pierced the silent night, a mix of grief and fury. Susan didn't wait to see if there were any more surprises. She ran, not stopping till she reached the safety of her car. The next morning, the sun shining deceptively bright, Susan reported everything to the police. But when they arrived at the McGowan residence, it was abandoned, as if no one had lived there for decades. Derry moved on, as it always does. But Susan left, seeking solace in a town less haunted by its past. And while she tried to forget that fateful night, every full moon served as a chilling reminder of the horrors that lurk in the dark.
In the picturesque town of Castle Rock, Maine, an old Victorian mansion stood overlooking the sea cliffs, known locally as the Beacon House. For years, it remained empty, becoming the subject of town legends, until one summer it found itself listed on Airbnb. The listing was simple: historic Beacon House, experience vintage charm overlooking the ocean. Ellie, an adventurous young woman from the city, decided to book the mansion for a weekend getaway. She had often used Airbnb, meeting wonderful hosts and discovering unique places. The Beacon House, with its old-world charm, seemed like another perfect escape. Upon arrival, the grandeur of the mansion, set against the backdrop of crashing waves, took her breath away. A handwritten note on the front door read, "Welcome, Ellie. The house is yours. Enjoy your stay." With a sense of excitement, Ellie entered. The interior, though dated, was well maintained. Vintage portraits adorned the walls, heavy drapes framed the windows, and every room felt like it held a story. As night fell, Ellie decided to relax by the fireplace, a book in hand. However, as the hours slipped by, Ellie began to feel a presence, the feeling of being watched, the shadows that moved just beyond her periphery. She tried to shake off the unease, attributing it to the stories of haunted houses she had read as a child. Yet, as she moved to the kitchen to make a cup of tea, she noticed a message notification on her phone. Opening it, she was met with a photo, a picture of her reading by the fireplace taken from outside the window. Panic surged. She locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each room. Every noise amplified her fear, every creak an indication of an intruder. A call to the local police yielded little help. Castle Rock had its fair share of pranksters, they said. Unable to sleep, Ellie decided to scour the house, hoping to find a clue about her mysterious watcher. In the attic, amidst dusty old trunks and worn-out books, she discovered a photo album. Flipping through, she found pictures of guests, much like herself, who had stayed at the Beacon House. But each picture had a distinct mark, a red cross on their faces. The reality dawned on Ellie. The Beacon House was not just a rental, it was a hunting ground. She remembered the note, "The house is yours." It wasn't a gesture of hospitality, it was a game. Another notification on her phone broke her reverie. A message. "Did you like the album? You'll be added soon." Terrified, Ellie decided she had to leave. But as she descended the stairs, the front door slowly creaked open. A tall silhouette stood there, a camera hanging by his side. The stalker. But instead of approaching her, he simply whispered, "It's all a game, Ellie. You're the prey. The house is the maze. Will you escape?" Ellie, adrenaline coursing through her veins, bolted towards the back door. The house seemed to come alive, windows shutting on their own, lights flickering. The chase was on. Using her knowledge from the earlier exploration, Ellie tried to outsmart her pursuer, setting makeshift traps and hiding in the shadows. The stalker was always just a step behind, his camera flash revealing her hiding spots. As dawn approached, Ellie found herself cornered in the basement. But, noticing a weak wooden panel, she used her strength to break through, emerging out on the cliffside. Without looking back, she ran towards the neighboring houses, the stalker's laughter echoing behind. The police arrived at the Beacon House to find it empty. No sign of the stalker. The Airbnb listing vanished, as did the account of the host. Ellie returned to the city forever changed. Castle Rock, with its dark secrets, faded in her rearview mirror. But every camera flash, every unknown message notification, always brought her back to that nightmarish weekend at the Beacon House.